When examining how India dismantled the British Empire, historians often focus on protests or economic boycotts. But the most effective tool for independence wasn't a physical weapon, it was the English language, a tool they suppressed for decades. In the early 19th century, the Indian subcontinent was a fractured landscape. Dozens of regional languages prevented large-scale communication, and the existing caste system strictly controlled access to learning. Most of the population was entirely locked out of formal education. The British East India Company preferred it this way. They maintained a deliberate policy to deny education to the general public, fearing that an educated population would eventually organize and rebel. Colonial records from that era are blunt about this strategy. Officials wrote that their policy was to keep the natives of India in the profoundest possible state of barbarism and darkness. Any attempt to diffuse knowledge was viewed as a threat to the stability of their rule. The empire relied on the isolation of its subjects. As long as the general population remained divided by language and geography, the colonial machine could extract wealth without resistance. But that isolation was about to be challenged by a group with a different agenda. Christian missionaries arrived and began lobbying the British administration for the right to build schools. They fought official resistance for years, arguing that they needed to bring English education to the masses. Their goal was religious, not political. They believed that teaching English would allow Indians to read the Bible and adopt Western moral standards. They were focused on winning converts, not overturning the government. However, these schools forced a shift in how Indian society functioned. Students from different castes, groups that had been historically segregated and forbidden from interacting, were now sitting in the same classrooms, learning from the same books. By placing students in a shared educational environment, these schools started to produce a new generation of reformers. These young people began to look past traditional social divisions, focusing instead on the common problems facing their communities. By ignoring traditional status markers in favor of academic progress, the missionaries created a shared experience for a new class of thinkers. This didn't erase India's complexities, but it provided a common social baseline that allowed this small, influential group to coordinate across old boundaries. The curriculum went beyond grammar. To teach the language effectively, missionaries used texts that covered modern European philosophy and current events from around the world. Indian students began reading the history of the American War of Independence and the French Revolution. They were studying the exact mechanics of how colonies and citizens could successfully challenge absolute power. They also followed the Irish Home Rule movement closely. They drew inspiration from Charles Stewart Parnell, a Protestant leader in Ireland who spearheaded the resistance against British governance through liberal political strategy. These Irish sacrifices deeply influenced Indian thinkers like Aurobindo Ghosh. He studied Parnell's methods and the Irish struggle, looking for a way to adapt those strategies to India's quest for freedom. This international influence even shaped India's most famous rallying cries. While Bal Gangadhar Tilak popularized the slogan, "Swaraj is my birthright," it was originally coined by Joseph Baptista, an Indian Catholic with Irish roots who drew directly from the Home Rule ideology. Reading about foreign rebellions in a foreign language gave these young Indians a blueprint. They were acquiring the ideological framework necessary to dismantle the colonial system from within. English solved a massive logistical problem for the independence movement. For the first time, leaders from Bengal, Punjab, and the South had a common medium. They no longer needed translators to sit at the same table and discuss national issues. This common language allowed this intelligentsia to form the Indian National Congress. They united delegates from across the subcontinent into a single political entity. The British had introduced their language to better manage their subjects, but the Indian elite turned it around. They used English to draft the very manifestos that demanded the British leave the country. This shared language also connected them to global shifts during World War II. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, influenced by Christian ideals regarding human freedom, began to champion the right of all people to choose their own government. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill signed the Atlantic Charter, which promised self-determination to all nations. Because India's leaders spoke the same political language, they held the British accountable to this promise. English functioned as a tool for international leverage. It allowed Indian nationalists to translate their local struggle into a vocabulary that global leaders understood, forcing the British to defend their colonial policy on the world stage. With the global promises of the Atlantic Charter as a backdrop, Mahatma Gandhi gained the political confidence to launch the 1942 Quit India movement, knowing the British could no longer justify their presence. After decades of social shifts and unified political pressure, the colonial era ended. In August 1947, India emerged as an independent nation. The British administration had originally hoped to train just enough clerks to run their offices. Instead, their system produced the revolutionaries who would oversee the departure of the British. The missionaries arrived to teach faith and literacy, intending to create a more manageable population. Instead, they provided the skills and the international perspective that allowed India to claim the right of Swaraj.